بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. So we're continue to read from Nafahat Itriyya for Dr. Nur Itr, Hafidhahullah, may Allah preserve him. And we had read about the Hijrah last time, and this session will begin with what the author calls Bina al-Mujtama', the building of society. And as you may already be aware, the Hijrah is kind of a turning point. I won't say in the Prophet's life only or in the Muslim's life, but I would say in the history of humanity. It's a turning point. It is likely the first community society built upon a set of principles and ideals rather than strategic location or people coming together for a particular interest. But this particular society, especially for the Muhajirin, the ones who left, for them it was completely about making commitment and being completely devoted to the idea of building a society that the Arabian Peninsula and the world hadn't seen before. So this is why Umar ibn Khattab chose to begin this Muslim calendar, Islamic calendar, beginning with the Hijrah. So we're in the year 1437. That means 1437 years after the Hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because it was seen as that kind of watershed demarcation. And Dr. Nuruddin, he says here, حفظه الله, كانت الهجرة فرقانا بين الحق والباطل والضعف والقوة مكنت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن ينشر دين الله ويقيم بناء المجتمع على هداية الله. So the Hijrah was a furqan, right? A divider, a distinguisher between haqq and batil, between truth and falsehood, والضعف والقوة, and weakness and strength. مكنت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن ينشر دين الله. It facilitated and made it more constructive for the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم to propagate the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ويقيم بناء المجتمع على هداية الله, and also to build the pillars of the society, of the community, on the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقام النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مجتمع المسلمين على ركن التآخي في الدين آخى بين الأنصار والمهاجرين وكان إخاء فريدا آثر فيه الأنصار على أنفسهم المهاجرين إخوانهم وتلقوا المكاره عنهم ودافعوا عنهم بأموالهم وأنفسهم كما وصفهم الله عز وجل فقال في المهاجرين أولئك هم الصادقون وفي الأنصار ويؤثرون على أنفسهم ولو كان بهم خصاصة ومن يوق شح نفسه فأولئك هم المفلحون. So the Prophet ﷺ did a couple of things very early on when he was building this mujtama', building this community. I think last time we touched upon it briefly, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he enters into Al-Madinah, ala sahibiha afdal salatu wassalam, and he's on the back of his naqa, his female camel, al-qaswa, and he told the people, da'ha fa innaha ma'mura, leave her alone because she is commanded and she'll sit down where we're supposed to be. And he sat down by the house of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari radiallahu anhu, where he stayed for a while until they built the masjid, which was a plot of land that was forsaken for the most part and belonged to two orphan boys. Prophet ﷺ paid for its purchased that land, and from there he built the masjid and also the rooms for him and his wives where he would reside. So that was an important aspect, that there was a central place that would bring people together, and that would be the masjid. So it became kind of the focal point. Yes, in Mecca, while they're in the Meccan period, they had the haram, but they didn't have access to it. So they're not able to congregate there. And so now the masjid became the center of the community and social life. And one of the first things he also does, as is mentioned here, أقام النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مجتمع المسلمين على ركن التآخي في الدين. So the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم built this community of Muslims on the principle of ta'akhi, brotherhood, in the interest of the deen. So not brotherhood in personal interest or self-interest or interest of the tribe, was going on before. So it was a complete revolution to look at it not from the interest of the tribe, but rather based upon principles of the deen. So he did this thing called the ta'akhi, which means to make brothers or formulate a brotherhood, بين الأنصار والمهاجرين. So the Ansar, as they came to be known, or the helpers or the aiders, they consisted of the two Arab tribes who came to Islam, which were the Aus and the Khazraj. There was nothing preventing any of the three Jewish tribes from coming to Islam, but they chose not to. They could have been from the Ansar, but they were not. So we refer to the Ansar as the two Arab tribes, Al-Aus wal-Khazraj, and as we know, in the Bay'at al-Aqaba, in the Bay'ah, that they came for the 3 years in a row, and each time it was an increasing number till the last year, right before he made the Hijrah, 73 people, 73 men and 2 women came out to give Bay'ah to the Prophet ﷺ. So they were from the Aus and the Khazraj. So when he gets there, he does this iqa, so to have a brotherhood between members of the Muhajirin, those coming from Mecca, and members of the Ansar. And so the Ansar, appropriately named, they really were Ansar, right? Look, he mentions some of the verses here describing what they did. يُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. They are the ones who prefer others over themselves, even if they themselves are in a state of need, which is what they did. And many of them would say to their fellow brother from the Ansar, if I'll give you half my house, I'll give you half of my wealth. If I have more than one wife, I'll divorce one, and then you can marry her if you need a wife. This was to the degree that there was this ikha, this brotherhood between them. Very famously, the Ansari who was made as a brother to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he offered him this, and he said, no need for any of that, just show me where the market is, and I'll take care of myself, take care of my own needs. The Prophet ﷺ, I think for obvious reasons, he didn't choose one of the Ansar for himself, because then people would have thought, well, how come they get to be with the Prophet ﷺ? So he chose Ali, radiallahu anhu. And probably the reason for that, he's a family member, and so no one would think that there's this type of preferential treatment given, because he's a cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, he's the son-in-law. But basically for everyone else, there was an akha between one of the Muhajirin and one of the Ansar. So he changed what we call in mawazin. He changed the criteria by which people would evaluate their relationships. Usually it would be based upon interest and based upon tribe, as we said. This was a very tribal place. But while the Prophet ﷺ didn't eliminate the tribes, he sought to eliminate tribalism. The idea that all of relationships would be based upon your particular affiliation with any tribe. And so they were obviously not the same tribe, but yet they were coming together as brothers in the deen. So the Muhajirin on the other part, right, they were described by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الصَّادِقُونَ. Right, they are the ones who are sadiq. They are the ones who are truthful and honest and sincere. Why? Because they gave up everything. Literally, they only came with a shirt on their backs to Al-Medina. They had nothing. They couldn't take much with them because they had to leave secretly and at night and without anyone seeing them, and how much can you carry and so forth. So they came there with nothing, and they came solely for Allah and His Prophet. So hum ulaikum as-sadiqun. So generally we think of the best of the Muhajirin as the closest and the highest companions, even though we talk much about the best of the Ansar, and they have a lofty position as well, but the Muhajirin were the ones who gave up everything, literally. So he says here, Dr. Nuruddin Itr, فَاصْدُقْ يَا أَخِي مَعَ اللَّهِ لِتَكُونَ مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ وَأَنْفِقْ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ وَأَهْلِهِ لِتَكُونَ مَعَ الْمُفْلِحِينَ. Right? So he says, فَاصْدُقْ يَا أَخِي. So be sincere, be truthful, so that you can be amongst those who are truthful, as-sadiqeen. Because one of the things about sidq, about sincerity, about sincere people, they find each other. Right? And the Quran mentions this, أُولَٰئِكَ مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ, to be with them. right? So if you're not one of them, then try to be with them, then you could be like them. So sincere people find each other, and then if you associate with sincere people and you put yourself in their company, then you put yourself in a position where you can become like them. And I think, unfortunately, the opposite is true as well. If you're constantly around insincere people, then you will be like them as well. وَمَنْ جَالَسَ جَانَسَ, right? And whoever sits with a group, or الْمَرْءُ عَلَى دِينِ خَلِيلِهِ, right? Whoever sits with a group, then they're going to take some of their akhlaq. وَالْأَخْلَاقُ سَرَّاقَ, right? They transfer from one to another. الْمَرْءُ عَلَى دِينِ خَلِيلِهِ. The person is on the deen of their khalil, of their closest friend. So it's good and very recommended and highly encouraged to associate with those who are sincere. وَأَنْفِقْ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ وَأَهْلِ, right? And spend of what you have for the people of the deen, right? Because then you could be like the Ansar, right? Because the Ansar gave up, they too gave up a lot. It's not like they didn't give up anything, right? They're willing to give up half or even more of what they had. One of the famous qisas or stories you find is that one of the Ansar, he had one of the Meccans, and he was coming to his house to eat, and they only had a meal enough for one person. So he told his wife, don't turn on the siraj, don't turn on the lamp when he comes. Put our plates out, put his plate out, put food in his plate, leave our plates empty, and when we sit, we'll pretend we're eating. And then he eats. Because if he saw them not eating, he wouldn't eat either. So they pretended to eat while their brother from the Muhajirin is the one actually eating. And that was the level of, of love and mahabba and sidq, right, that even the Ansar had for the Muhajirin. عاقد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اليهود وعاهدهم على الموادة للمسلمين وحسن جوارهم وظهرت منه عليه الصلاة والسلام في كتب المعاهدات بادرة أولى في التاريخ هي تحديد معنى الأمة على أساس الدين ونظام الملة. So here he mentions what was the relationship with the non-Muslim tribes, the Jewish tribes. عاهد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اليهود وعاقد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اليهود وعاهدهم. So he made a treaty or an agreement, or what we would say today a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between him and the Jewish tribes. And he included them, as he says here, in the meaning of the Ummah, right? And that they are as one. And that if Medina is attacked, then they will defend it as one, right? Together. And there was no compulsion for them to become Muslim, even to be into that pact. And I don't think, and he kind of implies it here, that this actually happened ever before. That there was this type of treaty and pact. People are one community, different religions, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, but yet they agree to have a community and live as one. So this was part of the pact between them, al-mawaddat al-muslimin wa husni jawarihim, to have good neighborly relations, and to defend one another and to protect Medina as need be. And that was their agreement with, and the Jewish tribes of Medina agreed to that. وكمل بنيان الفرد والمجتمع والدولة وفق الأحكام الشرعية. كملت العبادات ونزلت الأحكام الاقتصاد والقضايا المدنية ونظمت الأسرة والأحوال الشخصية واستتب الأمن بما نزل من عقوبات الجناه ونظمت علاقات المجتمع المسلم مع سائر المجتمعات فيما يسمى اليوم العلاقات الدولية. فحق لهذه الأمة الفخر بالإسلام دينا والفرح بكماله نظاما كما أعلنه ربنا اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. So Dr. Nindin, he goes on to say that وكمل بنيان الفرد والمجتمع والدولة. So any society is made up of its different components. So the things that were completed were the individual and the community, and then their inter-community relations. In other words, what we would call state relations, what he calls dawla. So in other words, you have a community that kind of live under a similar pact understanding, and then they have relationships with those on the outside who are not necessarily in that similar understanding, but nevertheless, there has to be good relations, even if they're not in agreement about that. So this is when in the Medinian period, many of the ahkam, what we call ahkam al-shar'iyya, or the legal rulings, were revealed. Most of the long surahs in the beginning of the Quran have many of these ahkam, and they were revealed in Medina. like Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Ali Imran, Wal-Nisa, Wal-Ma'idah, right? Not in Al-An'am, but part of Al-An'am and Al-Anfal. These were revealed, and Anfal talks about, for example, the relationship or the ahkam dealing with war and just war. Surah Al-Baqarah talks about relationship with other people. Surah Al-Ma'idah also talks about dietary law. Surah Al-Nisa talks about inheritance law and marriage and divorce. So all of these things were revealed in the Medina period, Medinian time, because that was the appropriate time, when now it was building of a community of society. Most of the Meccan Quran or the Meccan surahs you will find talk about things that are more spiritual and about Tawheed and about Hijaj and bringing kind of definitive arguments and proofs against the mushrikeen, against the polytheists, against idol worship, and for the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of these things happened during this Medinian time, and the final verse in the Quran, according to some, as he ends off with here, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. In other words, the final verse revealed, on this day your deen has been completed. وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي. Right, and I have perfected and completed the blessing. وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. And I have been pleased with Islam as your deen. Surah Al-Ma'idah. So this was revealed, one of the last verses, if not the last verse of the Quran, because the shara'a, right, kamulat, it was complete. And many of them, or Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when this verse was revealed, he wept. Why? Because he came to a realization, if the mission is complete, right, and the deen is complete, then the Prophet has completed his mission, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That means if the Prophet has completed his mission, there's no more reason for him to stick around. So he wept because he knew that the time would be coming soon for that. So he kind of summarizes all of that happened during the Medinian period. In the next section, he talks about the ghazawat, or some of the battles that the Prophet ﷺ had to fight against the Quraysh. So the ghazawat in general, ghazwa generally means a battle that the Prophet ﷺ, he himself participated in. And you have to understand, when he left Mecca and he goes to Al-Medina, technically now Medina is a state, it's a community by itself, as was Mecca, and they were in a state of war with one another, right? The Meccans were the ones who had persecuted and who had killed some of the Sahaba and had robbed them of their wealth, and so the relationship from the outset was one of acrimony. And so some of the ghazawat were an outgrowth of that acrimony. And almost every single time it was the Meccans who were the aggressor. Definitely Ghazwat al-Khandaq, or the Battle of the Confederates, they're the ones who came to Al-Medina. They conspired with the Jewish tribes who betrayed the Prophet ﷺ, right, and joined the battle against him, even though they had the agreement and the constitution and the pact that they would fight for Medina, not against it. You also had some of the surrounding Arab tribes who also joined that Battle of the Confederates. Ghazwat Uhud also, the Meccans were the aggressors, they came out. Ghazwat Badr, the Prophet ﷺ had come to learn of the caravan that was passing through, Abu Sufyan, that was on its way back, and all that he was seeking to do was recover some of the losses that they had lost by leaving Mecca to begin with. And in response, when the Mecca chieftains got wind of this, they sent out an army. And they marched all the way to almost to Al-Medina, to the wells of Badr, which is closer to Medina than it is to Mecca. So you can make an argument that they too were the aggressor. They sent an army to fight the Prophet ﷺ. And we'll learn in the Sulh of the Hudaybiyah, when they actually made a treaty, it was for 10 years. And it was the Meccans who after 2.5 years broke the treaty. So the idea that the Prophet ﷺ, when he became more powerful and had an army, then he became the aggressor and sought to exact revenge, the facts do not bear that out whatsoever. The Fath of Mecca, the conquest of Mecca, if there was going to be any revenge, it would have happened on that day, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, when someone said to him, Al-Yawmi Yawmu Malhama, today is a day of epic battle, he responded, he said, La, Al-Yawmi Yawmu Marhama, today is a day of mercy, not of epic battle. And he instructed his army not to fight anyone unless they engaged them first. In other words, they were not to be the aggressor. They were not to engage anyone with sword. And he even set out a few places that were safe havens. Two places in particular. The Haram itself, anyone who goes there would be safe. And anyone who goes to the house of Abu Sufyan, who was the head of Quraysh at the time. So here, Dr. Nuruddin Itri says, غزواته صلى الله عليه وسلم ولما اطمأنت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الدار بالنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الدار واستقر به القرار توجه مع إقامة المجتمع المسلم إلى أعدائه الكفار فعقد الأولية وقاد بنفسه الغزوات وأرسل السرايا وشن على المعتدين الغارات فغزا 25 غزوة قاداها بنفسه وأرسل أكثر من 50 سرية بقيادة قواده واشتهر من معاركه بدر وأحد والخندق وقريظة وخيبر ومؤتة وفتح مكة وحنين وتبوك وذات العسرة. أنجز صلى الله عليه وسلم تلك العمليات الحربية كلها على كثرة عددها وتباعد مواقعها في فترة وجيزة تبدأ من السنة الثانية إلى التاسعة من الهجرة حتى دانت جزيرة العرب ودخلت في الإسلام ومدها نفسه للفتوحات. So he kind of very much summarizes, he doesn't go into any of the ghazawat. He said, however, that when the situation was stable in Medina, and now the Prophet ﷺ could actually field an army, right, and it could defend itself, then he sought to build that mujtama, to build that community, and also to challenge any threats that were to that community, which primarily was the polytheist in Mecca. So there's two terms that we should know here that we mentioned already. Ghazwa is a battle that the Prophet ﷺ, he himself participated in. There's something else called Sariyya, and a Sariyya is something where he sends an expedition or a group, and it could be a small group, could be 9 or 10 men, but when he sends such a group to engage a threat, then that's called a Sariyya if he himself did not participate. So Dr. Nuruddin, he mentions here that the Prophet ﷺ fought in 25 ghazawat that he participated in, and he sent over 50 expeditions that he did not participate in. And the most well-known ghazawat that he participated in, as we mentioned, Badr and Uhud, wal-Khandaq or Al-Ahzab, which is the Battle of the Confederates, the Battle of Bani Qurayza, which was in the aftermath of the Confederates, Khaybar as well, Mu'tah, Ghazwat Mu'tah, which was when he sent some of his of the Sahaba who were more or less on a dawah expedition, but they were ambushed. Fathu Mecca, the conquest of Mecca, Jazwat Hunayn, which happened after the conquest of Mecca, and then Tabuk, Dhatul Usra, which actually was not a battle, but they went all the way there and they came back without fighting. But it was called Dhatul Usra because it was a very difficult summer expedition. So when you look at it, like, oh wait, 25 battles and 50 minor ones, there must have been like massive casualties and a lot of people getting killed and all that. I think I had a presentation on this that I did a while back, but I think the total number of people, both from the Muslim side and from the polytheist side, who were killed in all of these battles and all of these saraya was something in the neighborhood of 250. That's it. Today, warplanes can drop bombs on Aleppo, Halab, or anywhere else, and easily 250 will die in a single night, if not in a single bombing. And we have weapons like the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where tens of thousands of people were killed in an instant. So, you know, to say that they were kind of bloodthirsty and then they sought the killing of people, you know, 250 people out of a total of thousands that participated in these battles, right? Sometimes the armies were as large as 10,000. The army that was part of Al-Khandaq or Ahzab, the Confederate army, was 10,000 men, right? And the Prophet ﷺ even didn't go out to greet that army because the odds were too big. He only had about 3,000 maximum in Medina. And so he had a sort of war council with some of the Sahaba and said, what should we do? Some of them said, let's go out to meet them. That was an option. But it would have been 3,000 versus 10,000. And they were better equipped. So they didn't like that option, right? You could have said, well, they got the Prophet ﷺ with them. They should have, you know, how could they lose? But as we remember from the Hijrah, right? Didn't we say that the Prophet ﷺ did things so that he showed the people coming after him the respect for the asbab, for material causes? Could Allah have not given him a miracle where the 3,000 could have easily defeated the 10,000? Of course he could have. Ghazwat Mu'tah, right? It said that there only a group of Sahaba who numbered in a few thousand were able to hold off 100,000. Were able to hold off more than 100,000. That's miraculous, right? So when the ma'una was needed, right, when there was a miracle that was needed and they did take their precaution, they didn't know those numbers were against them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to them. But it doesn't mean that you make the assumption we're going to be granted a miracle, right, because we're good people. Prophet ﷺ wanted to teach people that's not the way that you think. So when Salman al-Farisi made the recommendation, radiallahu anhu, that, well, back in Persia where he was a prince and he's aware of war tactics, he said, when we would be faced with such an army assault, we would dig a trench, right? Because the main threat is from their horses. Because a man on horseback can do a lot of damage. A man on horseback and maybe 10 people infantry, he could take them out back then. So they had to have a way, devise a way so that the horses could not get to them. So they dug a wide and deep trench. And that's exactly what they did. And it took them 3 days to do it. But they did it. Fortunately, they didn't have to dig all the way around Al-Medina. They only had to do one side because the other sides were surrounded either by mountains or volcanic rock that the horses couldn't traverse anyway. And so when the Confederate army gets there and they try to go over, horses fall, but then they're easily picked off by arrows. And so they tried to lay siege, right? And they stayed there nearly a month, laying siege to Al-Medina, but then a heavy sandstorm came to the degree that everything was blown away and they couldn't sustain it and they left. And that was the end of it. So that battle, when 10,000 on one side and 3,000 on this side, probably the total number of casualties was in, you can count on your fingers. Maybe 10, 20, I don't know. It was not a lot, right, compared to the numbers that were participating. So, and these battles were more for about the meaning behind them rather than the idea of taking revenge, right? As we said, Fath Mecca was not about revenge. Prophet ﷺ, when he gets to the Kaaba and he finds people clinging to the walls of the Kaaba and they're afraid, they're legitimately afraid of what's going to happen to them because they know what they did. And so they said, what will you do with us? Khalas, they're at the complete mercy of the Prophet ﷺ and his army. Right? And he said, I will say to you as Yusuf said to his people, right? لا تثريب عليكم اليوم أنتم الطلقاء. Or he said to his brothers, there is no blame upon you. Today you are free to go. He didn't force anyone to become Muslim. People wanted to stay could stay. People wanted to go can go. And there was no retribution that day. So, he says here then, ولو النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما كانت فتوحات ولا كان للعرب شأن يذكر إلا ما كانوا عليه من التخلف والفقر ليكون درسا للمسلمين أن يحرصوا على فريضة الجهاد ليتخلصوا من الضعف والقهر. So he said, had it not been for Islam and the Prophet ﷺ, the Arabs never would have been anything. Right? The Arabian Peninsula at the time and the Arabs living in it, they were not anything. They were not considered to be a threat or even anything important by the Byzantines or by the Persian, the Sassanid Empire. They were like, this backwards desert, arid region that they might occasionally trade with, but there was not much interest in them for there. Nothing there of natural resources, nothing that they had much interest in, nothing of culture. So, however, when the Prophet ﷺ was sent, this is what made the Arabian Peninsula important. And it made it within a quarter of a century that both the Byzantine and the Persian empires crumbled. And now Islam was dominant in those two areas. So Dr. Nuruddin said this is a lesson for us that we should be steadfast and we should be patient and we should not forget about the different obligations that we have upon us, because when our deen is strong and we are strong, then everything around us will be strong. But if we are not strong, then there's nothing else that we have that will give us strength. We will not find strength via anything except the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And this is mushahad, this is witnessed. Right? You look at all the Muslim countries today, they're not strong because generally they don't follow the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So the next section he talks about الصلح الفتح الحديبية ودعوة العظماء. Here he's talking about the treaty or the sulh that happened وفي السنة السادسة للهجرة تم صلح الحديبية. So in the 6th year after the hijrah, the treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah was completed. وهذا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم المشركين على ترك الحرب 10 سنين. So they agreed to not have any hostilities between them for a period of 10 years. And the reason for this is that in that 6th year, the Prophet ﷺ set out with his companions, or some of them, to make Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. And so they get close to Mecca, and then they are greeted by the Meccans before they get there, and they said, stop. Where are you going? We don't want you to come. And then a period of negotiation began, and finally it was agreed that the Prophet ﷺ can come back the next year, the 7th year, with his companions, and that they agreed to this treaty. And many of the Sahaba were upset about this. Amongst them was Umar radiallahu anhu. He even said to the Prophet ﷺ, are we not upon truth and they are on falsehood? So why are we capitulating? Right? And we have swords, why don't we fight them? That's what he wanted to do. But the Prophet ﷺ knew what was behind this. Right? And the Quran says, and we read it in the Mawlid every night or every week, إِنَّ فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا. Right? What is this Fath al-Mubin? What is this opening that was given? The majority of the Mufassirin say that opening was the treaty of Hudaybiyah. That the very treaty itself was an opening. And even though the treaty only lasted 2.5 years before it was broken by the Meccans, more people entered Islam in those 2.5 years than all of the years before that. And so when we're talking like exponential increase. So instead of a few thousand, they became 10 and 20,000 as a result of those 2.5 years. And that's what facilitated the conquest of Mecca, right? It wasn't that the Prophet ﷺ was saying, okay, we have enough numbers now, let's go get them. They broke the treaty. Had they not broken the treaty, the Prophet ﷺ, and the Quran says, Al-Muslimun ala shurutihim, right? Muslims, whatever condition they put down, whatever contract they make, they have to stick to it. So had they not broken the treaty, the Prophet ﷺ would have been content for the 10 years to expire. But they're the ones who broke the treaty. So he says here, وَظَنَّهُ الْمُسْلِمُونَ تَنَازُلًا لِعَدُوِّهِمْ. So some of them thought that it was a type of compromise for their enemy. وَكَانَ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ نَصْرًا لَهُمْ. But in reality, it was a win, it was a nasr, it was a victory for the Muslims. And as we mentioned, Allah said, إِنَّ فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا. We have opened for you a great opening. هدأت النفوس في السلم من حمية القتال والصدام وأصبح لدى الناس استعداد أكبر لسماع دعوة الإسلام وتمتع المسلمون بحرية التنقل وتبليغ الدعوة والقرآن فكثر الإقبال على الإسلام وأسلم من كبراء قريش جماعة منهم خالد بن الوليد وعمرو بن العاص وعثمان بن طلحة سيد الكعبة المشرفة. So he said, in this period of peace, 2.5 years, هدأت النفوس, right? People calmed down during this period of peace from fighting and confrontation. And then in turn, people had more of a preparedness and more of a willingness to listen to the da'wah. So some amongst the Quraysh said, okay, we're not going to fight them anymore right now, but maybe we should hear what he has to say. And amongst those who did hear what he had to say were people like Khalid ibn Walid, right, who was instrumental in making a turn in Ghazwat Uhud for the mushrikeen, for the polytheists. Amr ibn al-As, very influential as well. Uthman ibn Talha. So these were influential people who now, they rode all the way out from Mecca. Khalid ibn Walid and Amr ibn al-As came together, and they rode all the way out from Mecca to Medina, and they said, we want, to make the shahada. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. So Muslims also were able to travel freely. They can go to Mecca and back and see their relatives and see, So this was a fath. But it was not a complete victory, right? And it shows you that if the qanawat, if the channels of da'wah are open, right, then there's no need to talk about fighting and killing and taking out the kuffar and all of these things that many of our misguided youth talk about. Here in the United States, at least till right now, we'll see what happens after the debate tonight, if things change, but until now, you know, we can open up learning centers and masajid, and we can put things on the internet, and we can talk about the deen all we want. It is an open market. There are people opposing us and people who will misconstrue what the deen says, but nevertheless, we do have the freedom to talk about it. No one's going to do anything to us about it. So that is what all that the Prophet ﷺ wanted. And if he got it out of a Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, then there's no reason to fight, right? There is no concept of a perpetual war against people who are not Muslim, just because they're not Muslim, and that we need to fight them until they become Muslim. This is a foreign concept to the deen. It's misconstruing what it actually says. Because if that were the case, then why would the Prophet ﷺ make a treaty? And it's not like what some of the academics say, well, he was weak and so he wanted to, you know, just, you know, kind of bid his time a little bit until they were strong enough, then they can overturn. But that's not how it turned out, right? Because within the treaty time, more people came into the deen, and the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, we have a critical number now, let's go take Mecca. But he would never do that. He would never break the treaty. It was the Meccans who broke the treaty. And so, as I mentioned, many of the people of Quraysh became Muslim, and it was in this period of time that the Prophet ﷺ had what we call like a tamakkun, that you know, Islam was kind of solidified, and the Medinian community was solidified in this period. So during this time, he says here, وأرسل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رسله وكتبه إلى الملوك والعظماء مثل كسرى الفرس وهرقل الروم والنجاشي بالحبشة والمقوقس بمصر والحارث بن أبي شمر الغساني بالشام والمنذر بن ساوى بالحيرة بين جزيرة العرب والعراق وغيرهم من ملوك الأرض والعظماء يدعوهم إلى الإسلام. So during this time, the Prophet ﷺ also began what we would call foreign relations, and he invited the other neighboring kingdoms and communities to come to Islam. So he sent letters to Kisra, which is the title of the emperor of Persia, and Hirqal, who is the Caesar of the Byzantines, and Najashi, who was the Ethiopian king, والمقوقس بمصر, who was the king of Egypt, والحارث بن أبي شمر الغساني بالشام, who was in Syria, والمنذر ibn Sawa بالحيرة. So Hira is a place, he says here, between Jazirat al-Arab and Iraq, a place, what would be considered today Iraq, and others from amongst those that he invited to Islam. And it's mentioned in the Shamaail that when the Prophet ﷺ wanted to send these letters out, he was told by those in the know that they will not accept a letter from your messenger unless it has some type of seal to know it's authentic. And that's when he very famously took his ring, right, that said Allah, Rasul Muhammad, and he used that as the seal to seal his documents. So he adopted something that was foreign to the Arab culture at the time, but there was no harm in it. In other words, from the principles of the Sharia, there was nothing wrong with it. So he said, take a ring and to seal it, then that's perfectly okay. And the ring, even after the Prophet ﷺ passed, remained with the treasury, because it remained to be used as the official seal all the way up until the time of Uthman, when he lost it in the well of Iris in Medina. So he adapted to be able to speak to these different constituencies outside of the Arabian Peninsula. ثم كان فتح مكة المكرمة في السنة الثامنة. Then the opening or the conquest of Mecca was in the 8th year of Hijrah. Hudaybiyah was in the 6th. We said 2.5 years, so the 8th year. ودخل الناس في دين الله أفواجا. Many people came into the deen at that point. وأقبلت على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في السنة التاسعة الوفود. And in the 9th year of Hijrah, what we call the year of delegations, عام الوفود, 9th year, is when all of the Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula more or less come into Islam. And they each send a delegation from their tribes pledging allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. That happened in the 9th year of the Hijrah. تبايعه على الإسلام وتعطيه العهود فسمي ذلك العام عام الوفود, as we said, the year of the delegations. استقرار الإسلام, now he mentions the last section here in terms of the Seerah, or second to last, which is the استقرار or the establishment of Islam. وفي السنة العاشرة شمل الإسلام جزيرة العرب. So by the 10th year after the Hijrah, Islam had all but encompassed the whole Arabian Peninsula. واستتب له الأمر وتمكن في الأرض وأرسل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم العمال والولاة يديرون مناطق الجزيرة ويعلمون الإسلام. So at this point, Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would send out provincial leaders to look over the outlying areas of the Arabian Peninsula, and he also sent people to teach people about the deen as well. وحج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بالناس حجة الوداع وخطب في عرفة خطبته الشهيرة التي أشار فيها للوداع وذكر بأصول الإسلام في أمور الدنيا والدين وحمل مسؤولية التبليغ عنه أمة المسلمين فقرر آخر كل فقرة منها قوله الجامع ألا هل بلغت اللهم فاشهد. وفي هذا اليوم الأعظم نزل عليه صلى الله عليه وسلم اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. فالحمد لله على إكمال الدين وإتمام النعمة رضينا بما رضي الله لنا. So then the Prophet ﷺ made the Hajj, which was in the 10th year, and the Prophet ﷺ only made Hajj once, and this was it, in the last year. And then he gave the khutbah in Arafah, which is a sunnah until today, for the Imam to give a khutbah in Arafat. And he gave the very famous khutbah that was known as Khutbat al-Wida', the farewell sermon. وذكر بأصول الإسلام في أمور الدنيا والدين. And in this, it felt like a farewell sermon, because he talked about things that he was putting now into the trust of people, right? He said, استوصوا بالنساء خيرا, right? Treat your women well, treat your neighbors well, treat your children well. لا فضل عربي على عجمي ولا عجمي على عربي ولا أسود على أبيض وأبيض على أسود. No. Allah, Allah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. الوصيلة والفضيلة والدرجة الرفيعة وبعث مقام الوعد إنك لا تخلف الميعاد وصلى الله عليه وسلم رب العالمين. So we'll finish for tonight Hajjat al-Wada', where he gives a farewell sermon, and he talks about the foundational principles, as we mentioned, that the only preference one person has over another is by the taqwa of Allah. So it's not for an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, or a white over black, or black over white, illa bi taqwa Allah, except by the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on that day, as we mentioned, the last verse to be revealed, the day where it says, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, on this day we have completed your deen, and we have given you the perfect blessing, and we have been pleased with Islam as your deen. Speaking to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فالحمد لله على إكمال الدين وإتمام النعمة رضينا بما رضي الله لنا الحمد لله رب العالمين. So we'll pick this up next week, inshallah. Alhamdulillah.